Veronica hummed a cheerful tune as she placed the final touches on the floral arrangements. She looked around her living room, now transformed into a veritable garden. With her wedding to Steve just a week away, excitement filled the air. She glanced at her list and checked off another task, feeling a surge of accomplishment. In just a few days, she would walk down the aisle, and everything had to be perfect. Veronica noticed her son Oliver sitting unusually quiet at the breakfast table. His cereal bowl was barely touched, and his eyes were fixed on nothing in particular. Normally, he was a chatterbox in the mornings, full of stories and plans for the day. She tried to make small talk, but he only offered monosyllabic responses. Something was definitely off, and it concerned her deeply. Veronica tried to reassure Oliver about the upcoming wedding. "Steve is a great guy, you know that," she said, trying to catch his eye. But Oliver continued to look down at his untouched cereal. She reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away, making her heart sink. She knew he needed time, but his avoidance was beginning to worry her more than she wanted to admit. Steve decided it was time to bond with Oliver. "How about we catch a baseball game together? Just the two of us," he suggested with a hopeful smile. He had planned this outing for weeks, thinking it would be the perfect opportunity to connect. He hoped that sharing something fun would help break the ice, and maybe, just maybe, bring them a little closer. Oliver looked at Steve, then down at the floor, before giving a reluctant nod. "Okay, I guess," he muttered, barely audible. Steve tried to hide his disappointment and put on a brave face. "Great! We'll have a blast," Steve said, trying to stay optimistic. He patted Oliver on the back, wishing he could break through whatever wall was keeping them apart. At the baseball game, Steve made every effort to engage Oliver in conversation. He pointed out interesting plays, shared trivia about the players, and even bought Oliver his favorite snacks. Each attempt was met with minimal enthusiasm. Steve felt like he was walking on eggshells, unsure of what might finally get through to Oliver. But he kept trying, determined to make the day enjoyable. Oliver's responses were short and distant, leaving Steve increasingly frustrated. Every attempt to engage him seemed to hit a dead end. He asked Oliver about his favorite team, and Oliver simply shrugged, barely looking up. The more Steve tried, the more it seemed like Oliver was pulling away. His frustration grew, but he bit his tongue, not wanting to make things worse. On the drive home, Steve couldn't keep his concerns to himself any longer. "What's bothering you, Oliver?" he asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. The silence was deafening, and Steve hoped for some kind of breakthrough. He knew something was wrong and wanted to help, but Oliver continued to stare out the window, offering no answers, only more questions. Oliver mumbled an excuse when Steve pressed him for answers. "Just school stuff," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Steve knew it wasn't true, but he didn't push further. The car ride continued in silence, the tension palpable. Steve felt a mix of worry and helplessness, but decided it was best to back off for the moment. He hoped Veronica might have better luck. Veronica began to notice the growing tension between Oliver and Steve. Every interaction seemed strained, and it was affecting the whole household. She caught Oliver sneaking glances at Steve, only to look away quickly when he felt her eyes on him. Veronica felt torn, wanting to understand what was bothering her son while also trying to be supportive of her fiancé. Something had to give, and soon. Veronica decided to spend some one-on-one time with Oliver to get to the bottom of things. She suggested an afternoon together, just the two of them. Oliver seemed hesitant, but agreed. They settled on a walk to the nearby park, hoping the relaxed setting would make it easier for him to open up. As they strolled, Veronica looked for the right moment to start the conversation. They walked along the park's winding paths, passing blooming flowers and chirping birds. Veronica glanced at Oliver, who seemed more relaxed outdoors. She took a deep breath and gently probed. "Oliver, is there something on your mind? You know you can tell me anything." Oliver kicked at a pebble and kept walking, clearly reluctant to share. Veronica waited, hoping he would feel ready to talk. Oliver remained evasive, giving short answers that circled around the truth. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, whenever she tried to dig deeper. Veronica patiently matched his pace, hoping her silence would encourage him to open up. But Oliver seemed bothered and unwilling to detail what was on his mind. Each step felt heavier, as frustration and worry gnawed at her. She knew this wasn't just about school. Later, Veronica attended her bridal fitting, feeling conflicted about Oliver's silence. As the seamstress adjusted her gown, her thoughts were miles away. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously troubling her son. The dress fit perfectly, but Veronica's mind was elsewhere, tangled in worry. She smiled at her reflection, trying to focus on the coming joy, but the weight of Oliver's troubles lingered. Steve noticed the tension too, and decided to confront her about Oliver's attitude. "What's going on with Oliver?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Veronica sighed, unsure how to explain what little she knew. "He's just going through a phase, I think," she offered weakly. Steve was visibly frustrated. "This isn't just a phase, Veronica. We need to get to the bottom of this." Veronica promised Steve that Oliver would come around with time. She tried to reassure him, saying that kids needed time to adjust to big changes. "He's probably just nervous about the wedding," she suggested. Steve nodded, but remained unconvinced. "He's a good kid, and he'll see that you're good for us," she added, trying to ease both their worries. Steve sighed, hoping she was right. Feeling stuck, Veronica sought advice from her best friend, Karen. They met at their favorite coffee shop, and Veronica poured out her concerns. Karen listened carefully, her eyes full of understanding. "Oliver's always been a sensitive kid," she noted, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Veronica nodded, grateful for the empathetic ear. Karen had always been good at helping her see things from a new perspective. Karen suggested giving Oliver more time to adjust to the idea of Steve. "Remember how tough it was for him when you first started dating?" she reminded Veronica. "He came around eventually, didn't he?" Veronica sighed, hoping Karen was right. "Just give him some space and time. Keep the lines of communication open, but don't push too hard," Karen advised. Veronica felt a bit more hopeful. Despite her worries, Veronica decided to push forward with the wedding plans. There were invitations to finalize, seating arrangements to confirm, and countless details to manage. She threw herself into the preparations, hoping the positive momentum would rub off on Oliver. Deep down, she trusted that everything would fall into place. "It will all work out," she whispered to herself, focusing on the path ahead. Steve's mother, Janet, arrived in town for the wedding preparations. Her presence brought a new dynamic to the household. Janet was a whirlwind of energy, immediately diving into helping with the arrangements. Veronica appreciated her enthusiasm, but also felt a bit overwhelmed. As they reviewed the plans, Janet asked about Oliver, sparking a fresh wave of concern in Veronica. She wondered if Janet's arrival would help or complicate things. Janet met Oliver for the first time, and the encounter was tense. Oliver stood in the hallway, his eyes darting nervously. Janet extended a warm hand, offering a smile. Oliver hesitated, glancing at his mother before shaking Janet's hand reluctantly. Veronica watched the exchange, feeling uneasy. She could sense Oliver's discomfort and tried to encourage him with a gentle nod, but he seemed more withdrawn than ever. Veronica noticed Oliver's anxiety spiked whenever Janet was around. Even simple interactions seemed to unsettle him. Whenever Janet entered the room, Oliver's posture would stiffen and his eyes would search for an escape route. Veronica couldn't ignore how different her son was acting. She knew something was bothering him, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The tension in the house was becoming palpable. Oliver became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding spending time with Janet altogether. He would retreat to his room or find reasons to be out of the house. Veronica found it harder to engage him in conversation, and he seemed more distant with each passing day. This worried her deeply, as Oliver had always been communicative. Veronica tried to bridge the gap, but her efforts were met with silence. Janet tried to be friendly, but her efforts were met with resistance from Oliver. She would invite him to join activities, like helping with decorations or playing a board game, but Oliver would always decline politely. Janet shared stories and joked, hoping to get a smile from him, but he remained impassive. She looked to Veronica for any insights, but even Veronica was at a loss. Steve noticed the growing tension and urged Janet to back off and give Oliver space. "He just needs time," Steve reassured her. Janet reluctantly agreed, though she was baffled by Oliver's coldness. She backed off a bit, hoping that a little distance might ease the tension. Oliver seemed a bit more relaxed when Janet wasn't hovering, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. Steve hoped this approach would help. In an attempt to ease the tension, Veronica arranged a family dinner. She hoped a relaxed meal might open up lines of communication. The table was beautifully set, and a delicious spread was prepared. Oliver sat quietly, fidgeting with his fork, while Janet and Steve chatted. Veronica did her best to keep the mood light, but she couldn't ignore the heavy atmosphere. Something needed to change. During dinner, Oliver barely touched his food and remained silent. Veronica watched him closely, noticing his discomfort. Small talk flowed around him, but Oliver seemed trapped in his own world. Every now and then, Janet would try to draw him into the conversation, but he responded with monosyllabic answers. Veronica's worry deepened as she saw how disconnected her son had become in such a crucial moment. Janet tried to lighten the mood by sharing stories about Steve's childhood. She animatedly recounted funny incidents and sweet memories, hoping to draw a laugh from Oliver. Steve added his own anecdotes, which brought smiles to everyone except Oliver. He pushed his food around his plate, clearly distressed. Veronica joined in the storytelling, but her eyes never strayed far from her son's troubled face. The tension was clear. Abruptly, Oliver pushed back his chair and left the table, clearly upset. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard. Veronica hastily excused herself and followed him, her heart racing with concern. As she caught up with him in the hallway, Oliver kept walking. His steps hurried. The evening had taken a drastic turn, and Veronica knew she needed to get to the root of his distress immediately. Veronica followed Oliver to his room and closed the door behind them. She demanded to know what's wrong, her voice gentle but firm. Oliver sat on the edge of his bed, avoiding eye contact. Veronica sat beside him, urging him to open up. "Please, Oliver, talk to me," she pleaded. The room was thick with silence, and Veronica's heart ached as she awaited his response. "Mom, don't marry him!" Oliver suddenly shouted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. Veronica stood frozen in the doorway, stunned by her son's outburst. Oliver's face was flushed, and his fists were clenched tightly at his sides. Without another word, he stormed back into his room, slamming the door behind him with a force that made the walls tremble. Veronica winced, feeling her heart break just a little bit. Veronica stood in the hallway, her mind reeling from Oliver's explosive outburst. She tried to process his words, each syllable echoing painfully in her head. How could her sweet, gentle son be so vehemently against her marriage to Steve? She took a deep breath, attempting to calm her racing thoughts. The whole situation left her feeling dazed and helpless, unsure how to reach out to her distressed son. Steve came hurrying over to find out what had happened. "What's going on?" he asked, concern etched across his face. Veronica opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out. She was too stunned, too overwhelmed to form a coherent explanation. Steve gently placed a hand on her shoulder, looking into her eyes for some kind of answer. But Veronica could only shake her head, still dumbfounded. The next day, Veronica tried several times to talk to Oliver, but he skillfully avoided her each time. He left early for school, skipped breakfast, and only returned home after dark. Every attempt Veronica made to sit down and talk was met with evasive maneuvers. She felt a growing sense of frustration and helplessness, as the distance between her and Oliver seemed to widen with each passing moment. Veronica felt increasingly torn between her love for Steve and her deep concern for Oliver. She tried to balance her time and attention between them, but it felt like an impossible task. Every loving moment with Steve was shadowed by thoughts of Oliver's unhappiness. Her heart ached with indecision, and she constantly questioned whether moving forward with the wedding was the right choice amid Oliver's turmoil. In desperation, Veronica called her best friend, Karen, and confided in her about Oliver's alarming outburst. Karen listened intently, concern evident in her voice as she asked questions. Veronica poured out her doubts and fears, feeling a little lighter with each word. She explained how Oliver had become increasingly withdrawn and how his anger had come out of nowhere. Karen's comforting voice was a much-needed solace. Karen advised Veronica to find a way to get Oliver to open up, suggesting he might be holding back something important. "Maybe he's scared or embarrassed about something," Karen suggested. "Give him some space, but also let him know you're ready to listen when he's ready to talk." Veronica nodded, feeling a small glimmer of hope. She knew Karen was right. She just needed a way in. Veronica decided to postpone a couple of wedding events to focus more on Oliver. She sat down with Steve and explained her plan, hoping he would understand. Steve listened patiently, his initial frustration giving way to understanding. He agreed that Oliver's well-being had to come first, even if it meant delaying their wedding plans. Veronica felt a small sense of relief, knowing she had more time to support Oliver. Steve was initially frustrated by the postponed wedding events, but eventually agreed to prioritize Oliver's needs. He took a deep breath and said, "We'll figure this out together." Steve's willingness to put family first reassured Veronica. His support meant everything to her as they navigated this challenging situation. Despite the delay, their bond grew stronger as they united in their concern for Oliver's well-being. Veronica decided to take Oliver to his favorite park, hoping the familiar and calm environment would encourage him to open up. They walked through the park trails, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves around them. Oliver lagged a few steps behind, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Veronica pointed out birds and flowers, trying to engage him in small talk. Gradually, she sensed his guard coming down. Oliver remained silent during their walk in the park, but Veronica could sense he wanted to talk. She could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept glancing at her, as if searching for the right moment. Veronica decided not to push him, giving him the space he needed. She hoped that by staying calm and patient, Oliver would eventually feel comfortable enough to share his thoughts. As they paused by a small pond, Veronica gently asked Oliver why he didn't want her to marry Steve. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded. Oliver kicked at some pebbles and avoided eye contact. Veronica remained silent, giving him time to gather his thoughts. She could see the conflict in his eyes, and she wanted to understand what was troubling him so deeply. After a long pause, Oliver finally opened up a little, admitting that he didn't trust Steve. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words seemed to carry a heavy weight. Veronica's heart ached at the pain in her son's voice. She didn't interrupt, waiting for him to continue, but Oliver clamored up again, retreating into his shell. Veronica sighed inwardly, knowing this was just the beginning. Veronica gently pressed for more details, asking Oliver if Steve had ever done anything specific to hurt him. Oliver shook his head, but refused to say anything more. His silence was deafening, and Veronica could feel her worry intensifying. She softly assured him that it was okay to speak up, and that she wanted to help him work through whatever was bothering him. Still, Oliver remained silent, looking troubled. Veronica couldn't shake the growing worry gnawing at her heart. Oliver's refusal to open up fully left a gnawing uncertainty in her mind. She wondered what could be causing her normally open and cheerful son to behave so uncharacteristically. Each passing day without a full explanation only heightened her anxiety. In her mind, she ran through every possible scenario, desperately trying to pinpoint the root of his concerns. Steve could sense the tension and decided it was time for a man-to-man talk with Oliver. He approached Veronica with the idea, and she reluctantly agreed, hoping Steve might get through where she couldn't. Steve found Oliver in his room, immersed in a video game. He knocked gently on the doorframe, signaling his presence. Oliver glanced at him but didn't say anything. Steve took a deep breath and started. Oliver tried to avoid the conversation, focusing intently on his game. But Steve was persistent and insisted they talk. He turned off the game console, much to Oliver's annoyance. Oliver rolled his eyes, but knew he had no choice but to engage. Steve sat down on the edge of the bed, looking Oliver in the eye. He spoke calmly, ensuring to maintain a comforting tone throughout the conversation. Steve asked Oliver point-blank if he had done anything to upset him directly. Oliver looked away, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. He muttered a quick no, but Steve could tell there was more to it. He encouraged Oliver to speak freely, assuring him that his feelings were valid. Steve hoped that by showing empathy and understanding, he could break through the wall Oliver had built around himself. Despite Steve's best efforts, Oliver avoided the question and refused to talk. His silence was frustrating, but Steve didn't want to push too hard and risk pushing Oliver further away. He decided to give Oliver some space and let him know he was there if he needed to talk. Steve left the room, feeling more determined than ever to find a way to support both Oliver and Veronica. Veronica decided it was time to call a family meeting, hoping to create an environment where everyone could discuss their feelings openly. Around the dining table, she gathered Steve and Oliver, urging each of them to share their thoughts. She started by expressing her own feelings of love and concern for both of them. Oliver looked hesitant, but seemed to appreciate the effort. Veronica hoped this would be a turning point. Oliver is reluctant, but agrees to attend the family meeting. He had been avoiding such gatherings for a while, but knew he couldn't keep dodging forever. Veronica tried to make the invitation sound casual, though the underlying tension was palpable. They drove to the meeting in silence, Oliver staring out the window. When they arrived, he plastered a smile on his face, trying to mask his unease. Veronica breaks the ice by sharing her own concerns and questions. She wanted to show Oliver that he wasn't alone in feeling uncertain. Sitting around the dining table, she opened up about her doubts, making it clear she wanted input from both of them. Oliver listened, nodding occasionally, but kept most of his thoughts to himself. Veronica hoped honesty would encourage Oliver to share. Steve expresses his desire to make things work with Oliver. He leaned forward, sincerity etched on his face, explaining that he genuinely cared about Veronica and wanted to bond with Oliver too. Steve recounted his own experiences of being a stepson as a teenager, trying to find common ground. Oliver fiddled with the edge of his napkin, still keeping his emotions in check, offering a curt nod in response. Oliver listens but remains tight-lipped about his true feelings. He knew what Steve was trying to do and appreciated the effort, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of distrust, particularly toward Steve's mother, Janet. The memories of his encounters with her made his skin crawl. He stayed silent, opting instead for non-committal responses. Veronica shot him concerned glances, but he avoided her gaze, not ready to open up yet. The family meeting ends without resolving the underlying issue. Despite Veronica and Steve's best attempts to create an open dialogue, Oliver's silence kept the true problem buried. They concluded the meeting with promises to keep talking and trying to understand each other better. Oliver gave Veronica a brief hug and headed to his room, feeling the weight of unresolved emotions press down even more heavily. Veronica feels more confused than ever about how to help Oliver. She thought being open about her concerns would pave the way for Oliver to do the same, but his tight-lipped demeanor shut that door. Standing in the kitchen, she replayed the conversation in her mind. All she wanted was to create a loving, united family. But Oliver's discomfort made her doubt if they were moving in the right direction. Oliver avoids spending time at home, preferring to stay at friends' houses. The confusion and tension were suffocating, and he found it easier to be anywhere but home. His friends didn't question his constant presence, thinking he was just trying to enjoy their company. Veronica noticed his absence and felt a pang of loneliness mixed with concern. Every time she tried to reach out, Oliver found an excuse to leave. Veronica speaks to Janet about Oliver's discomfort around her. She tried to choose her words carefully, explaining that Oliver seemed particularly uneasy around Janet. Janet was taken aback, unaware that Oliver felt this way. She had always thought she was being welcoming and was puzzled by the revelation. Janet promised to step more gently around Oliver, hoping that maybe some one-on-one time could bridge the gap between them. Janet is surprised and suggests spending more one-on-one time with Oliver. She wanted to get to know him, to understand his interests and worries. Janet proposed some neutral activities they could do together, like going to a museum or having lunch at his favorite restaurant. Veronica appreciated Janet's willingness to make an effort and hoped this plan would help dissolve the invisible barriers between them. One day, Oliver breaks down and reveals his fear of Janet to Veronica. He couldn't hold it in any longer, the anxiety eating him up from the inside. Through tears, he told her about his unsettling encounters with Janet, how they made him dread even the thought of her. He admitted he was ashamed to face his fears, worried they might come across as childish. Veronica felt her heart sink, realizing the depth of his struggle. Oliver sat down heavily, his shoulders slumped. "I'm scared of Janet, Mom," he admitted quietly, his voice trembling with shame. "She's always criticizing me, and it feels like she doesn't even like me." He looked at the ground, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over him. "I didn't want to say anything because I know you really like her, but I just can't pretend anymore." Veronica pulled Oliver into a tight hug, her heart breaking for her son. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry you've been feeling like this," she said softly, stroking his hair. "Your feelings are absolutely valid, and I'm so glad you told me." She held him for a long time, feeling his tension slowly start to dissolve. "We're going to figure this out together. I promise," she reassured him. Veronica took a deep breath and made the difficult decision. She knew she had to put Oliver's well-being first. That evening, she sat down with Michael and explained the situation. Although it broke her heart, she decided to call off the wedding. "Oliver's feelings need to be taken seriously," she said firmly. "I have to respect what he's going through right now, and I hope you understand." Steve was devastated by the news, but listened to Veronica with a heavy heart. "I understand," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Oliver's well-being comes first. I just wish things were different." He tried to hold back his own tears, offering Veronica a tight, supportive embrace. "Take all the time you need," he whispered. "I'm here for both of you, no matter what." Veronica called Janet to explain the difficult decision. "Janet, we need to postpone the wedding," she said hesitantly. Janet's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "It's because of Oliver. He's been feeling really uneasy, and I need to prioritize his well-being," Veronica explained. She waited for Janet's reaction, her heart pounding, unsure of how she would take the news. Janet was taken aback by Veronica's words. "I had no idea Oliver felt that way," she finally said, her voice full of concern. "Please, Veronica, let me help. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right for him." Veronica felt a small glimmer of hope, hearing Janet's willingness to change. "Thank you, Janet," she replied. "This means a lot. We have to do what's best for Oliver." Oliver looked at his mom with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thanks for believing in me, Mom," he said, hugging her tightly. "I know this wasn't easy for you." Veronica smiled and kissed the top of his head. "There's nothing more important to me than your well-being," she replied. "We'll get through this together, no matter what happens." Oliver felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Veronica decided to seek professional help for Oliver. She scheduled an appointment with a therapist who specialized in adolescent anxiety. "This will help us understand what you're going through and find ways to cope," she explained to Oliver. He nodded, a bit apprehensive but willing to give it a try. Veronica felt hopeful that this could be the beginning of a positive change for them both. With the support of his therapist, Oliver began to unpack his anxiety and fears. Each session opened up new insights into his feelings about Janet and the changes in his life. "This is hard, but it feels good to talk about it," he admitted after one session. Veronica noticed a gradual improvement in his mood and behavior, grateful for the progress he was making. Veronica and Oliver committed to rebuilding their relationship, focusing on trust and open communication. They spent more time together, enjoying activities that Oliver loved. "I'm really proud of you," Veronica said one evening as they walked in the park. "We've come a long way." Oliver smiled, feeling more connected to his mom than ever before. They knew their journey was far from over, but they were stronger together.